When the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa first entered service in 1941, Japanese pilots looked at it with something close to reverence, as if it were a living extension of the fighter culture that had defined the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force since the 1930s. To them, the Ki-43 was not simply a new aircraft, it was the embodiment of a philosophy, a doctrine born from decades of training that preached absolute mastery of the turn fight. The Army's fighter schools at Akeno and Shimoshizu had drilled into every pilot the belief that victory was a matter of skill, of discipline, of outmaneuvering an opponent until the perfect firing position presented itself. The Ki-43 was designed to make that doctrine invincible. Engineers stripped every ounce of unnecessary weight from its frame. No armor plate protected the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks guarded against incoming fire. The wings were built large and light, the controls tuned so delicately that even small stick inputs produced elegant flowing movements. In test flights, the Hayabusa could outturn nearly everything in the sky. Pilots described it as a feather carried on the wind, a machine that reacted as quickly as thought itself. In China and Southeast Asia, where its earliest combat sorties took place, the Oscar built a fearsome reputation. Against outdated fighters like the Brewster Buffalo and the slower, heavier Hurricane Mark II, the Ki-43 danced effortlessly. Chinese Air Force Hawk 3s and Soviet-supplied I-133s could not match its turning circle. When the Pacific War erupted, Japanese Army pilots entered Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies convinced that they were flying the finest dogfighting aircraft in the world. Their confidence grew into certainty when early opponents fell quickly. The RAF squadrons defending Malaya, flying overburdened Buffaloes and Hurricanes, reported that Oscars seemed to twist through the air as if made of paper and wire. In the Philippines, the few P-35s and P-40Bs available were flown by inexperienced American pilots, who often tried to turn fight with the Japanese, a mistake that ended predictably. In Dutch East Indies, the KNIL pilots flying Buffaloes and P-36s were overwhelmed. Everywhere the Ki-43 appeared, it seemed untouchable in close combat. Japanese commanders believed the Oscar's miracle maneuverability confirmed their doctrine. Agility was more important than firepower, speed, or protection. In an era when other nations began adding armor and heavier guns to their fighters, Japan doubled down on lightness. Why weigh a plane down with steel plates if it made the aircraft less able to turn? Why reinforce fuel tanks if a skilled pilot would never be hit? That mindset shaped the Oscar's most fatal flaws. Its two Ho-103 machine guns, firing 12.7mm rounds at relatively low velocity, were barely enough to cripple early war opponents. Its lack of armor meant that even a few hits from enemy guns could shatter control lines or ignite fuel. But in 1941 and early 1942, those weaknesses seemed irrelevant. Japanese pilots survived because they were seldom hit at all. The Oscar's success fed into something even stronger, a cultural belief. Japanese fighter pilots considered themselves heirs to Bushido, warriors whose individual skill determined victory. The Ki-43 reinforced this belief beautifully. It rewarded instinct, finesse, and reflex. It punished hesitation. It was a machine built for dueling at knife-fight distance, for slicing into tight horizontal turns where only the most disciplined pilots survived. Yet even as Japanese aces celebrated their victories, U.S. intelligence officers were already studying Oscar wreckage in the Philippines and Java. They noted the absence of armor plate. They noted the unprotected fuel tanks. They noted the fragile wing spars and lightweight fuselage structure. When these reports reached American fighter squadrons in Australia, New Guinea, and India, they produced a revelation that stunned Japanese aviators when the next phase of the war began. The Oscar's superiority existed only at low speed, only in turning combat, and only against opponents willing to play by its rules. The United States had no intention of playing by those rules. American doctrine emphasized speed, dive power, and firepower. P-40, P-38, F-4U, and later F-6F pilots were taught never to turn with a Japanese fighter, ever. They would attack from altitude, fire short bursts of .5 caliber rounds, and dive out of reach. Japanese pilots assumed the Oscar's agility made it untouchable. American pilots saw something different, a fragile, unarmored target one burst away from destruction. But in early 1942, Japanese airmen could not yet imagine this future. To them, the Ki-43 remained the purest expression of their air combat doctrine, an aircraft with the soul of a swordsman. It had brought victory everywhere it flew. It had reinforced the belief that turning skill conquered all. And because of that, the Oscar carried its pilots into the next year of the war with the deadly illusion that maneuverability alone could defeat America. They would soon discover that in a sky filled with high-speed, heavily armed fighters, agility was worthless if the first burst of .5 caliber rounds tore an aircraft to pieces. The Oscar's legend had begun in triumph, but its downfall had already been written into its design.
The illusions surrounding the Ki-43 Hayabusa began to break not in a dramatic, fiery confrontation, but in a series of quiet, methodical air battles fought over Burma, the Philippines, and New Guinea in early 1942. Here, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force met a fighter that on paper looked inferior, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, but in practice exposed every structural weakness of the Oscar. Japanese pilots entered the theater expecting to repeat the effortless victories of Malaya and Java. They believed the P-40, a heavier American fighter with thick wings, armor plating, and poor low-altitude climb, would be just another aircraft incapable of matching the Ki-43's turn rate. The first engagements seemed to confirm this. In the opening skirmishes over Rangoon and Java, inexperienced American and British pilots made the same mistake Allied flyers had made in 1941. They tried to turn fight with the Oscar. The result was predictable and brutal. Ki-43s slipped behind them, closed in, and fired the light 12.7mm Ho-103s into their tails until the P-40 spiraled down trailing smoke. But something changed almost overnight. The first American volunteer group, better known as the Flying Tigers, had already learned the truth about Japanese fighters. Claire Chennault had spent years observing Japanese aviation in China, and he taught his pilots a doctrine that seemed outrageous to traditional fighter tactics. Never turn. Never engage horizontally. Never slow down. Attack from advantage and escape before the Japanese could react. When Japanese pilots next encountered P-40s over Burma, they expected another flurry of easy kills. Instead, they found an opponent that refused to give them the turning fight they needed to survive. P-40 pilots slashed in from altitude, dove at extraordinary speed, fired short bursts from their 6 Browning AN M250 caliber machine guns, and then dove away at speeds impossible for an Oscar to match. The Ki-43's lightweight airframe, which gave it breathtaking agility, became a liability in these encounters. It could not dive safely at high speed. The wings vibrated, control surfaces stiffened, and the airframe risked catastrophic failure. Japanese pilots tried to follow P-40s downward, but the Oscar shook violently long before the Warhawk even approached its terminal dive speed. In dive after dive, P-40s struck Oscars before the Japanese pilots even understood the new rules of engagement. The shock set in slowly, disguised by Japanese skill. Although the Oscar remained dangerous in tight combat, American pilots simply refused to enter the trap. The Americans had something else the Japanese had never experienced before: durability. The P-40 was armored. It had bulletproof glass, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a rugged Allison engine that could absorb punishment and keep flying. In early 1942, this was revolutionary to Japanese fighter pilots. They were used to battles where a few 7.7mm rounds crippled an enemy aircraft. Now, their Ho-103 12.7mm guns, already firing comparatively light rounds, struggled to penetrate an American fighter's protection unless fired from extremely close range. Japanese pilots began reporting something unprecedented. Their bullets simply did not stop the American fighters. Meanwhile, every time the 50 cal struck the Ki-43, the results were immediate and catastrophic.
A single burst could ignite the unprotected fuel tanks. The lightweight wings shredded under heavy fire. Control cables snapped, sending Oscar pilots tumbling helplessly through the sky. American P-40 pilots described Oscars as exploding like paper lanterns. In Burma, the 23rd Fighter Group and RAF No. 67 Squadron discovered another advantage. The P-40 thrived in high-speed dives and vertical maneuvers. Where the Ki-43 excelled only in horizontal turn fights, the P-40 dominated every vertical engagement. The moment a Japanese pilot tried to pitch up and follow, the Oscar bled energy too fast, stalling while the Warhawk maintained momentum and rolled back into attack position. The Japanese were stunned. Their doctrine, built entirely around agility and the pilot's skill at low-speed maneuvering, suddenly seemed useless. Oscar aces, many with dozens of kills from China, found themselves unable to force their preferred type of engagement. It was the first moment the Japanese Air Force realized something profound. The Americans were not losing because their aircraft were inferior. They had simply been fighting the wrong kind of battles. And now that they understood the Oscar's limitations, the skies began to tilt against Japan. In New Guinea, the situation worsened. P-40 units like the 49th Fighter Group used altitude, radio coordination, and boom and zoom tactics to devastating effect. Even when outnumbered, they struck and escaped with near impunity. Reports from the 5th Air Force noted that Japanese fighters refused to take the vertical fight, an admission of tactical desperation. Ki-43 pilots who once believed themselves unbeatable now faced an opponent their aircraft simply could not counter. By mid-1942, the myth of the Oscar was cracking. A nimble fighter was deadly only when the enemy accepted its rules. The Americans refused, and the Ki-43, for all its elegance, had no answer. The first shock had arrived, and Japan had no idea that far worse was coming with the arrival of the P-38 Lightning. If the P-40 Warhawk delivered the first cracks in the Oscar's legend, it was the arrival of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning in 1943 that shattered Japanese confidence completely. In New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Bismarck Archipelago, the Lightning changed the air war with a brutality and finality the Ki-43 was never designed to withstand. Japanese pilots who had grown up believing that maneuverability won battles found themselves suddenly, violently outclassed in every measurable dimension except turn rate. And for the first time, turn rate meant nothing. The P-38 was unlike anything the Japanese Army Air Force had encountered. With twin engines, turbo superchargers, heavy armament clustered in the nose, long range, and a climb rate that the Ki-43 could not dream of, the Lightning was a machine built for vertical fighting and high-speed engagements, precisely the sort of combat the Oscar was least capable of handling. When the 5th Air Force began deploying P-38s out of Port Moresby and later Dabadura, Japanese reconnaissance pilots initially dismissed the aircraft as too heavy to pose a threat in dogfights. Within weeks, that assumption proved fatal. The first encounters over Leh and Selamawa revealed the terrifying mismatch. P-38 pilots attacked from altitude, diving at speeds the Oscar could never match, unleashing a devastating burst from 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose. The concentrated firepower, something the Japanese had never seen, combined with the Oscar's total lack of armor, made survival unlikely. P-38 pilots described how a single burst ripped off wings, ignited fuel tanks, or split the light fuselage apart. In one after-action report, a P-38 pilot from the 39th Fighter Squadron wrote, "The Ki-43 burned before I even pulled up." Japanese pilots attempted to repeat the tactics that had worked against the slower and less powerful P-40. They tried to lure the P-38s into low-speed turn fights. But Lightning pilots simply refused. Instead, they performed high yo-yo maneuvers, climbing steeply after every pass, then rolling back down with overwhelming speed. The Oscar could neither follow the climb nor outrun the dive. It was trapped between two extremes, too slow to catch the Lightning, too fragile to survive a single hit. Even more devastating was the P-38's performance at altitude. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized medium and low-altitude combat because the Ki-43's supercharger was weak and its engine lost power rapidly above 20,000 feet. The P-38, with its turbo superchargers, thrived at those heights. American mission planning exploited this relentlessly. Flights of P-38s cruised high above Japanese formations, diving into Oscar units before they could react. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the attack that killed them. Over Wewak, in August 1943, this advantage reached its peak. In a series of massive airstrikes, P-38s swept the sky clean of Japanese fighters trying to defend their bases. The Oscar units of the 11th Sentai and 59th Sentai were massacred. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down during frantic attempts to climb into position. The loss ratio was catastrophic for Japan, often 10-to-1 or worse. U.S. intelligence estimates that some Oscar units lost 70% of their experienced pilots in a matter of weeks. The Japanese tried to adapt. They began launching Ki-43's at lower altitudes, hoping to engage P-38s as they returned from missions. They changed tactics to ambushes and surprise attacks. But the Americans had radar, coordinated radio communications, and better situational awareness. The P-38s flew in disciplined pairs and fours, covering each other with perfect vertical separations. The Oscar, lacking effective radios, could not match such teamwork. Japanese pilots often fought as individuals, relying on eyesight and instinct, skills that became useless when the enemy attacked at 400 miles per hour from above and disappeared before a counterstrike could form. Even in cases where the Ki-43 managed to survive the first pass and attempt a counterattack, it found new disadvantages. The Lightning climbed so quickly that Oscars could not pursue. Its high-speed roll rate allowed it to break from combat instantly. Its engines kept running even after absorbing damage that would have turned an Oscar into flaming wreckage. Japanese pilots began reporting a demoralizing trend. The enemy not only fought differently, he survived differently. One Japanese ace described shooting a P-38 at close range, only to watch it pull away trailing smoke while his Ki-43 burst into flames from a brief return burst. "It was like throwing pebbles at a bull," he wrote. The psychological impact was immense. In 1942, Japanese pilots believed their skill compensated for any technical disadvantage. By late 1943, that belief was crumbling. The Oscar had reached the limits of its design philosophy. Lightweight construction made it maneuverable, but maneuverability no longer mattered. Firepower mattered, climb mattered, speed mattered, survivability mattered, and in each of these areas, the P-38 ruled the sky. By the end of 1943, the Oscar had lost the air war in New Guinea. Its pilots fought with courage and desperation, but courage could not compensate for physics. The era of horizontal turning duels was over. Modern air combat belonged to the vertical. Lightning pilots mastered that dimension, and the Oscar, built for another era entirely, paid the price in fire and wreckage scattered across jungles and mountainsides. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Ki-43 Hayabusa was no longer just outmatched, it was obsolete. The arrival of two new American fighters in the Central Pacific, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair, marked the beginning of the end for Japan's lightweight doctrine. These machines were everything the Oscar was not: fast, heavily armed, armored like flying fortresses, and engineered for vertical fighting at high speed. If the P-40 had demonstrated that the Oscar couldn't dictate a turn fight, and the P-38 had shown that it couldn't survive modern air combat at altitude, the Hellcat Air Corsair exposed its final humiliation. The Oscar was utterly, hopelessly outclassed in every possible metric. The Hellcat entered combat in late 1943, sweeping through the Solomon Islands and Rabaul like a storm. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could unleash more than 72 kilograms of ammunition per minute, more firepower in a single burst than the Oscar could fire in 30 seconds. Against unarmored Ki-43s with no self-sealing tanks, the results were immediate and catastrophic. Pilots of VF-11, VF-17, VF-33, and other Navy squadrons described Oscars disintegrating in midair from a single half-second burst. Japanese pilots, who once relied on their ability to avoid hits through tight maneuvering, found themselves shredded by gunfire they never had the chance to avoid. What made the mismatch even more lopsided was the Hellcat's astonishing dive and climb performance. The F-6F could dive at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, far beyond the structural limits of the Ki-43. Whenever an Oscar attempted to turn inside a Hellcat, the American pilot simply rolled into a steep dive and re-engaged at will. Japanese pilots trying to follow the maneuver discovered, often fatally, that the Oscar's wings vibrated violently under high-speed airflow. Control surfaces stiffened, the lightweight airframe buckled, and many Oscars snapped apart in the dive. Against the Hellcat, the Oscar was not just slower, it was physically incapable of participating in the same dimension of combat. Yet if the Hellcat outpowered and outclimbed the Oscar, the F-4U Corsair did the same with even more brutality. Introduced across the Solomons and later the Philippines, the Corsair was fast enough to outrun an Oscar in level flight, powerful enough to outclimb it effortlessly, and tough enough to absorb hits that would have destroyed 3 Ki-43's. Marine pilots flying the F-4U in VMF 214, VMF 113, and others routinely faced Oscars over Bougainville and Rabaul. The Corsair had a reputation for killing Oscars so quickly that dogfights barely lasted seconds. Its gull-wing design and massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine gave it enormous dive acceleration. When the Oscar tried to escape, the Corsair caught it. When the Oscar tried to turn, the Corsair simply climbed vertically, rolled over, and dropped back down at high speed. Japanese pilots were stunned to find that the Americans had finally produced fighters that could dominate all aspects of combat simultaneously: firepower, durability, speed, climb, and dive. The Oscar had none of these advantages. Its engine, the Nakajima Ha-25, was reliable but produced nowhere near the power needed for modern aerial warfare. Its airframe, once considered a masterpiece of lightweight design, now made it dangerously fragile. And its armament, 2 Ho-103 machine guns, was a relic compared to the wall of .50 caliber fire thrown out by American guns. The psychological shock within the IJAF was enormous. Pilots who once boasted that no Western aircraft could match the Oscar's maneuverability now found themselves unable to force engagements on their own terms. Many Japanese reports from 1944 contain the same bitter refrain: "The enemy refuses to turn with us." It was not just a tactical frustration, it was an identity crisis. The Ki-43 had been designed for a world where horizontal turn fighting defined victory. Now, American fighters fought in the vertical plane, where maneuverability at low speed was useless. The defeat grew even more lopsided when American fighter direction networks came into play. Land-based radar, shipborne controllers, and clear VHF radio communication allowed Hellcats and Corsairs to intercept Oscar formations before they approached their targets. On the Japanese side, many Ki-43 units entered combat without functioning radios. Pilots often relied on hand signals or even visual cues from flight leaders, primitive methods hopelessly inadequate against coordinated American hunting groups. Over Truk in February 1944, the mismatch became painfully clear. In one day of fighting during Operation Hailstone, Hellcats destroyed dozens of Japanese aircraft, many of them Oscars, attempting desperate defensive sorties. Several U.S. squadrons reported engagements where Oscars were shot down before they could even begin evasive maneuvers. The pattern repeated itself at the Marianas, Leyte, and Formosa. The Ki-43, once the pride of the Japanese Army Air Force, became a symbol of helplessness. The most devastating encounters occurred during the Philippines campaign in late 1944. Hellcat and Corsair pilots encountered Oscars repeatedly over Leyte Gulf, Clark Field, and Luzon. The results were nearly identical in every battle. The Ki-43 was destroyed without inflicting significant losses in return. U.S. Navy kill ratios climbed to staggering heights. In some engagements, Oscar units lost nearly entire squadrons within minutes. One Navy pilot described the Oscar as a butterfly against a blowtorch. The humiliation was complete. Japanese pilots still fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could not overcome physics, engineering, or strategy. The Ki-43's legendary maneuverability had become a trap, a seductive advantage that meant nothing in the modern sky. Against heavy, fast, merciless American fighters, the Oscars simply evaporated. And the Japanese Air Force, already strained by losses in New Guinea, now faced annihilation wherever Hellcats and Corsairs appeared. The Oscars' downfall was no longer theoretical, it was total.
By 1945, the Ki-43 Oscar, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, had become a symbol of a doctrine that belonged to another century. Its defeat was not just the result of better American machines, it was the culmination of a strategic collapse that began years earlier, when Japan doubled down on a design philosophy rooted in the myth of the individual dogfighting ace. In an era when air combat demanded speed, firepower, communication, and survivability, Japan's insistence on building ultralight fighters turned from an advantage into a death sentence. The Oscar story ended where it began, with the belief that agility alone could overcome all other factors. But by the last year of the war, the skies above the Philippines, Burma, and Okinawa proved that belief to be as fragile as the Oscar's thin aluminum skin. The Ki-43's design flaws were no longer weaknesses, they were fatal certainties. The lack of armor, once accepted as the price of maneuverability, now meant that even a brief burst from American .50 caliber guns turned the aircraft into a fireball. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks, catastrophic even in 1942, became hopeless in 1944 when Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs dominated the skies. The light Ho-Rono 3 machine guns failed repeatedly against hardened American aircraft that could absorb damage and keep fighting. Japanese airmen wrote bitterly that their guns could not bring down the American planes unless they fired from suicidal range. Even worse than the aircraft's shortcomings was the strategic context into which Oscar pilots were thrown. By 1944, Japan no longer had the trained aviators who once exploited the Ki-43's agility. Wartime pilot training collapsed from a rigorous multi-year program into a desperate 3-month crash course. Rookie pilots who had never mastered basic formation flying were sent to fight Hellcat and Mustang veterans. The Oscar had always required finesse. It was too fragile for mistakes, too lightly armed for long-range engagements, too dependent on pilot mastery to exploit its maneuverability. Now it was flown by boys barely old enough to shave. The results were as tragic as they were predictable. The American air war machine was the opposite: disciplined, coordinated, technologically integrated. Radar stations guided fighters to interception points. VHF radios linked squadrons with ground controllers and ships. Fighter groups operated in the Finger 4 formation, maximizing mutual support and firepower. The Oscar's lack of reliable radios meant that Japanese formations often dissolved at the first sign of combat. Pilots entered chaotic turning fights individually, unaware of the larger engagement unfolding around them. Against U.S. fighters working as an integrated machine, the lone Oscar pilot stood no chance. By the time the P-51 Mustang entered the Pacific in late 1944, the Ki-43 was hopelessly outclassed. The Mustang was faster, climbed higher, dove harder, flew farther, and carried far more firepower. Against it, the Oscar was effectively a pre-war fighter forced into battles against one of the most advanced aircraft of the conflict. In the Philippines, Oscars attempting to intercept B-29s or escort kamikaze strikes were massacred long before reaching their targets. Japanese reports describe scenes of devastation. Entire Sentai wiped out in minutes, with not a single American loss in return. On the ground, the situation was equally dire. Fuel shortages crippled training, maintenance crews had no spare parts, engines wore out in leaked oil, guns jammed frequently. Many Oscars were thrown into combat straight from dispersed jungle bases, patched with bamboo, fabric, and metal scraps. The aircraft that once symbolized Japan's aerial prowess now represented overwhelming desperation. Yet even as the Oscar failed in combat, it revealed something important. Japan's air war doctrine, centered on agility, lightness, and individual pilot skill, had been built for a world that no longer existed. In the 1930s, when air combat occurred at low altitude and low speed, when turning duels resembled aerial fencing matches, this doctrine made sense. But the Pacific War introduced new realities: long-range escorts, vertical combat, radar-directed interceptions, coordinated squadron tactics, and fighters that could absorb punishment instead of avoiding it. The Oscar was a sword in a battlefield of cannons.
By 1945, the IJAAF deployed improved aircraft like the Ki-84 Hayate and Ki-44 Shoki, machines with armor, speed, and heavy guns. But they arrived too late, in too few numbers, flown by inexperienced pilots and starved of fuel. The Ki-43 remained the backbone of the Japanese Army Air Force simply because Japan could not produce enough of anything else. And so, the Oscar died the same way it lived, fragile, brave, outmatched, and flown by men who deserved better machines. In the final months of the war, many Oscar units transitioned into kamikaze formations. The aircraft that had once danced gracefully across the skies of Southeast Asia now plunged into ships as bombs. Its incredible maneuverability meant nothing. Its beauty as an aerial duelist meant nothing. Its designers' dreams of a lightweight, elegant fighter meant nothing. The Ki-43 had become a relic in a war dominated by American firepower, American industry, and American tactical evolution. The wrecks of Ki-43s lay scattered across New Guinea, Burma, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Each shattered airframe told the same story. Maneuverability without protection is meaningless. Courage without tools is tragedy. And no pilot, no matter how skilled, can overcome physics or firepower. The Oscar began the war as a legend. It ended as a warning.